Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bart Camp. We are on September the 9th. I lost the date, so there you go, how pro we are. And I'm back at Malcolm Blunt's house, and we're going to have another chat. This time we found a subject, or better yet, Malcolm found a subject, and which we're going to talk about. And the subject of today is Yuri Nosenko. Now, I don't know much about Yuri himself. I know that he was a defector and he came from Russia to the States, and I know that he was involved in the Oswald case, but how exactly is my first question. Malcolm, how did Yuri Nosenko get involved?
Well, first of all, I'm going to say that I'm probably going to ramble off in different directions.
Okay.
So if that's okay with you.
It's fine by me.
And the audience?
Yeah.
Okay. Yuri Nosenko originally defected, or it didn't actually defect, but he turned up and offered himself to some sort of intelligence agency in Geneva in 1962, in May of 62, when he was ostensibly working with a delegation of people that were there for a nuclear disarmament meeting, international nuclear disarmament meeting. And he was there as part of a security squad, basically. And he offered himself to one person, who then passed it on to another person, and then CIA realized they had what was possibly in the jargon a live one, and they interviewed him there. He comes into the Oswald business probably two years later, well, less than 2 years later, but in January of 64, when he came over, actually in Geneva, but he then wanted to defect properly. Originally he was supposed to defect in place, which meant he was supposed to go back to Russia and not come out. In other words, to work within the Soviet Union. But he turns up in January at another meeting in Geneva and says that he needs to actually defect to the US. He mentions that there's been a cable recalling him to Moscow, and he believes that they're onto him, and they believes he's in difficulty, in problems. So CIA talked to him and they're interviewing, and they're making, at this moment in time, this is obviously a couple of months after the assassination of President Kennedy, they're talking to Nosenko about this and about that, and then suddenly he says, oh, by the way, I handled Lee Harvey Oswald's file. Well, you can bet that got everybody's attention. And so he was allowed to defect based on those statements, that he actually saw, he was involved with the original defection of Oswald. He saw the material then, when he was in the Second Chief Directorate. And he saw Oswald's file again, I think, when the Mexico City business arose, when they were checking on him, who he was, and the request came back to KGB headquarters. So he claims he saw some of Oswald's files then, and then after the assassination he was involved with getting the files back from Minsk to Moscow. So we had all that, and CIA listened to this and they thought, well, you know, we have this guy, we've got the Warren Commission sitting, here's a guy, he's obviously an important material witness. So they interrogated him, they listened to him, you know, and what he actually said was the core statements he had for the CIA was the KGB weren't interested. They saw him as unstable, not normal, so they didn't speak to him. This is basically, and this was Nosenko's mantra. He said exactly the same thing over and over and over again without any difference at all, right through to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, when he said exactly the same. So, and that takes a lot of swallowing, that takes a lot of believing, because there were things going on. You know, for instance, there were the George Blake, the British double agent that was working for the KGB, but British intelligence didn't know this. He came back, I think he'd been in Europe, and he came back in May of 1959, to part of the part of MI6, which was called Production Services. Production Services was basically the bit of MI6 which dealt with training people to go as tourists to the USSR. It was similar in a way to SR-10, which was the American version in the Soviet division. So Production Services, he was working in Production Services, and there was a meeting around sometime in June of 1959, and where Blake was briefed on those programs, the British Tourist Agent Program and the American Tourist Agent Program. And of course, all that got back immediately to the KGB in Moscow. That's not to say they didn't know about this. Of course they knew about the tourist agent, but you know, what Blake gave them was the contents of the shop, basically, for both British and American tourist agents. So that was when you look at that, and you look at that in context with the defection of Oswald and defection of Webster, Ricordelli, and these other people, it's obvious that the KGB would really focus on the defectors that were coming in after they had that information, the crucial information. They would want to check. And so for Nosenko to say they didn't speak to him, he wasn't normal, that just does not resonate at all as a truth. So that was a false story. But I suppose the other thing you have to bear in mind is with Yuri Nosenko is what was the business with the message about Oswald? What concerns did the Russian government have that necessitated, if you like, Nosenko was a false defector in the first place? Because they knew, the CIA knew that his story about the cable recall was false. That was false. That never happened. So they knew they were dealing with someone that wasn't particularly credible.
Kosher.
Even that early date, even before
before the high life.
Before they were interrogating them,
Yeah.
And seriously interrogating them.
Yeah, I know.
But
I know.
so when you ask about what role did Nosenko play in a Nosenko business, we get into quite an involved business, I think. because it's clear from the research I've done that KGB knew all about Oswald in advance.
I read some of the files that
Yeah.
they are coming back and they say that about Minsk.
Yeah.
And some of them saying, oh no, there's nothing going on, this, that and the other, blah, blah, blah. And then on the other hand, there's stuff that they are watching.
More importantly, the CIA had knowledge of Oswald.
Yeah.
You know, prior to defection, because the document dissemination came through. It never went to where it was supposed to go. It was sidetracked by the security office, security research staff, and that was a major subversion of the system. You know, because they would have to fill up a document, a 1604 document, to get a change in dissemination. And they would have to do that before Oswald defected. In other words, they'd have to do the dissemination form, and they would have to say, look, if anything comes in on Oswald, it comes to us, and us only. That's it. So we're getting into some quite intricate maneuvers going on. I think the dissemination was probably to do with the loss of Pyotr Popov, the great GRU defector agent that was able to provide crucial military hardware information to the CIA. When he got arrested, a lot of people got very excited in the CIA, and they were concerned that he'd been betrayed by a mole. There were indications that it wasn't just due to routine surveillance or hard surveillance by KGB. It was that he was given up by a source inside CIA. Well, that, as you can imagine, that got Angleton's attention, and James Angleton, and he worked with the security research staff. So it looks like the sole intent, the intent of with Oswald was to utilize him in seeing whether they could activate a mole inside CIA, to see if the KGB actually contacted their mole, and in the process revealed themselves. That was the intent of that, I think.
I find that remarkable that you mention all this, because there's a movie with Kevin Costner, and it's called No Way Out. And there's a search for a spy, and the spy, of course, is called, the mole is called Yuri. And I'm going to spoil it for everybody. Costner is Yuri. But when this all came up, and the so-called tactics and the play, this, that, and of course they throw a bit of romance and death and investigation in, and Gene Hackman is in it as well. And it's an alright film, but what you just described there is basically happening in that film. I mean, of course, in a looser term as such. And it's just one of those typical examples of where something from the CIA is being used in mainstream Hollywood as such. And you know, you got a film with Costner and Gene Hackman as such, and that element that you just described of messing around as such, who's who, what it basically comes down, and who's messing with whom, and who is the infiltrator, defector, and so forth. That is exactly in that movie as such.
Yeah, I mean, it gets complicated and it gets complex, and because that's the way that's the nature of of espionage and spy activities. They are complex and they are difficult to follow, and it seems to me that obviously Russia had a problem because they had Oswald as a defector, and they had Oswald as a person accused and virtually convicted, by the media as the person that shot President Kennedy. Here was a guy that had been in Russia for, 3 years?
Yeah, almost, yeah.
Almost 3 years.
Yeah.
And so they needed a live one, and the live one was Nosenko. And what they did with Nosenko was they tacked on the story. They tacked on the Oswald story.
Nosenko gets, what I know of it is that he gets really good treatment at first, isn't it? I mean, he's taken in, and they listen to him, etc., etc.
Yeah, he went.
They give him some money.
That's right. The initial stuff was very good. I mean, he was out, drinking in bars, and he went to Hawaii on holiday, on vacation, and all sorts of stuff. But then, they realised it was getting out of bounds because he punched out a barmaid in a bar in Baltimore. He was getting a bit uncontrollable, and so they needed to put him into a more structured environment. So he went into a safe house for a proper interrogation, safe house in Washington. This is before the bunker business,
right?
Before Camp Peary.
Okay.
So there's a safe house in Washington which he went into, and he went through the process of interrogation of a defector by CIA is gruesome. It's not called the grinder for no reason. It's called the grinder when they go into a safe house and they have these constant interrogations. It's brutal. They just keep going and they go over the same point and the same point and the same point. So he went through that, and they became really unhappy with the answers. I think it's fair to say that they were not impressed with. There were so many different things that you could actually hang a hat on as being patently absurd with Nosenko. If you go to one of his biggest supporters was a guy from the Reports and Requirements called Len McCoy, a long time supporter of Nosenko, and got all the promotions. Actually made sure that Nosenko was treated well later on, and then pushed always to make him a bona fide defector. His belief was absolute. McCoy's belief was absolute. But I always say to people, there's an internal memo by Len McCoy, and you have it in the collection, in the Nosenko collection, where he mentions the fact that he's actually trumpeting how wonderful Nosenko is, and he says in this memo that Nosenko gave up the names of 2,000 KGB personnel. Excuse me.
That's quite a lot.
2,000, could you remember 2,000 people? 2,000 names of KGB personnel? That's what Nosenko gave. And the same guy doesn't know how to send a cable. The day-to-day role of a KGB officer means he's going to send cables, receive cables and send cables, maybe a dozen times a day. He doesn't know how to send a cable, but he can remember 2,000 names. I mean, I think just so many pieces of Nosenko that just don't fit. They're not. They're far from being a bona fide defector. He was completely the opposite. But he had to be accepted by CIA.
Why?
I asked Pete Bagley that question, and it always ended up the same way. And it was. He thinks Pete's thoughts were always that it was a political decision by CIA. Political decision. I said, well, what does that mean?
Means it comes from higher up?
Yeah. It comes from
Government.
higher up, but also from information that you're not privy to. So that was as far as Pete could get with it. I mean, I used to say to Pete Buckley when we talked, we talk about it, that you must be bitter about your treatment, because here's a guy, you know, a senior CIA officer. He was like chief of the counterintelligence division in CIA, in the Soviet division. His career looked to be going just one way, towards being director of CIA. Some say that. And then he has this gross misfortune to be the case officer for handling Yuri Nosenko, and boy, that was problems, and a career ender really for him, because he wouldn't back down. You know, he could have. He could have looked at the situation and said, look, and said to himself, look, my career is going to suffer if I continue to hold out and say this guy is not bona fide. But he is, you know, a false defector. But he didn't do that. He stuck to his guns and said this guy is a false defector. He is not bona fide. And that caused him the end of his career, really. I mean, he got transferred to Brussels. He was chief of station in Brussels. It wasn't where really. It wasn't where he was going to go. As far as his career was concerned, his career was going to be to the very top, probably. And Nosenko's the problems with Nosenko, because he wouldn't back down, because he wouldn't say, well, I think this guy could be, you know, he didn't say that at all. Never buckled. Never buckled.
He did a polygraph, or he did several polygraphs with this.
Nosenko.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of them is in, or an interrogation of him is among your documents, if I'm not mistaken. But the debate about this particular polygraph, there's a fair bit on it around as well, where people just wander around. Because the thing is like, in general, from what I get from reading or glancing at this material, a lot of people just don't know what to do with this guy, or don't know how to decide on this guy, and basically saying like, yeah, this guy's totally legit and whatever he says is correct, but there's no opposite either. There's no like.
Well, the problem is, you know, he gave up. He gave up people.
Like
he gave up Vassal, who's the you know, worked for the British Navy, and he gave up other people. I mean, I forget he gave up 2 or 3 other people, but he gave up the guy at Orly, the military guy at Orly, that was taking out packages and resealing packages of classified information. But he'd already been given up anyway. I mean, in the business, in the jargon, what Nosenko gave up were throwaways. The stuff that the KGB were happy enough for him to throw away. So I never found it, and Pete never found anything of significance.
no real value.
No, he gave up nothing. He gave up nothing of significance. And when he sat down with Peter Deryabin in 1965 for 6 weeks, I mean, at the end of those 6 weeks, KGB man, with alleged KGB man, it was a big no-no from Deryabin. And then you get into later where they try to shut Deryabin up. CIA tries to shut him up. He was threatened by CIA, you know.
Because?
Because he wouldn't change. He was, you know, he was adamant that Nosenko was a false defector. And then when you go to the papers, you go to the paperwork, you go to find documents that should be there. You know, Deryabin's testimony. in interviews, pre-interviews. It's not there. I mean, it's supposed to be released, but I look forward to reading it when it is released. You know,
like many other documents. Yeah.
But you see, you know, anywhere where there's problems, you know, it gets squelched.
So let's go back to the interrogations of Uncle Yuri. First he's in Washington, and then they take him into the hole, like this basement type of thing.
It's been described as a bunker.
Yeah, but this is also used in some kind of a TV movie of some sort where they have maybe it was the Matt Damon film with Al Pacino where they did was it The Good Shepherd? They've got somebody basically also locked up in some kind of a basement bunker style with a huge glass wall, and where basically they tell him to drink water from the toilet instead of handing him the water, blah blah blah. But it is also about you know that it is about the Nosenko period, about the defector coming in as such. That was the second time Nosenko actually was used. But I want to talk about why do you know why they actually moved from the Washington location, the safe house, to that bunker? And
well, the story was they wanted him in a more secure place. They wanted him, this is the reason he gave. They moved in there for security purposes. And it was a security office request to do that. They wanted him in a more secure location.
And how
the other side of that is, of course, it was a much more Spartan environment.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they can do whatever they want. They've got him under their control. How long did that go on for?
Went on for almost 3 years, I think.
3 years?
Yeah.
So he's practically in solitary confinement and only being woken up or talked to when interrogating.
64, 65, 60, maybe 2.5. Yeah. So, but he seemed to adapt very well to it. I mean, he did all. One of the things that Peter Darryavin noticed, that defector, the good defector, that doubted Nosenko's bona fides. One of the things he said was that, you know, Nosenko made chess pieces out of bits of wool, which is a thing that people do when they're in a gulag. It's one of these things that people do when they're in a gulag, because they've got nothing. They just make these things out of bits of wool, bits of fabric, anything. So he made a chess out of it. I think he took that away from him. Anything that looked like reading matter, they took away from him. I mean, they really did give him a hard time. I don't doubt that. But also, he gave them a hard time. You know, he drove them crazy. He drove CIA interrogators crazy. He drove them nuts. It was so frustrating for them, I think, to deal with. So frustrating. And when you get to the period of the House Select Committee, what's interesting is it gets mirrored with the guy that's the senior HSCA staffer that's dealing with Nosenko is Ken Klein. And when you read Ken Klein's notes, and you had those with the Nosenko material, I think it's 100 pages of notes, handwritten notes. And you see how frustrated that guy was, you know. Every other page is, he writes lies, more lies, liar. I mean, it's such a contentious subject, even to this day. I mean, it's people say to me, "Oh well, it's settled history, settled business," but it's not settled business. It's not settled history. Even for CIA, it's not settled history. They were trying to do what they called a reconciliation. I remember I met a historical review group officer in 2012 at a conference, the Raleigh Spy Conference, and she had the remaining Nosenko files in her office. So she was a custodian. She was the person dealing with Nosenko inside. So she was an interesting person to talk to.
No doubt.
And she said to me, what we're attempting to do is draw a line. This is like 2012. To draw a line under the Nosenko business. And I said to her, well, does that mean talking to Pete Bagley? And she said, oh yes, of course. Of course. So I'm all very, very excited about this. So next time I go to Brussels, I said to Pete, the CIA are doing trying to do a reconciliation of the Nosenko business, and you're going to get contacted. Never happened. They never contacted them at all. Never contacted them at all. So I mean, the reconciliation business may have been there, but you can see even then there was enough of a quandary going on inside, enough in the thinking of CIA that they wanted to do a reconciliation. They wanted to draw a line under it. So it wasn't settled history, like all these espionage writers. It wasn't settled. Not for CIA. If they were trying to do a reconciliation in it wasn't settled.
I think they probably want a reconciliation, and they probably also want to work towards that. But without the listening eye or ear from researchers and I don't know, they just want a nice little internal file and basically be done with it as such. And just, you know, we've done it, we've reconciled it, but you're not going to get to know anything.
I think it's,
anything public is just, it's not in their interest.
I think, also we were wrapped up in a problem there, because it looks like when Angleton was doing his mole hunt, he was looking in the wrong place. Everything went to the Soviet division. They were really focusing down on the Soviet division. That's where the problem lay. I mean, I accept partially that may be true, partially, but I think it seems to me there was another mole inside the security research staff, inside the Office of Security, and that was the most. That was where the deeper mole was. That's where the deeper problem lay, and it was right under Angleton's nose, which So it's a complex and difficult subject. When you asked me that original question about where does Nosenko fit in, where does Nosenko fit in? It's mega, because we get into we could talk about, for instance, that knowledge of Oswald held within the agency, the pre-knowledge of the defection. They're not going to want that coming out at all. That's got to be covered up at all costs. That's got to be covered up. And the idea that this guy was connected in any way, shape or form with the agency has got to be covered up. And so we have that difficulty. And when we get to Nosenko, we get this interesting sort of connection between the guy that sat in the security research staff on October the 31st, 1959, when information comes in on Oswald's defection from the State Department, and they get a request from Sam Papich via Jane Roman. And the request is, obviously, what you have on Oswald. And Bruce Solie, who's the guy that was deputy chief of the security research staff, writes on a piece of paper, tell Papich we have nothing on Oswald. So we know where he is. That's a flat out lie to another intelligence agency. Indeed, a flat-out lie to Jane Roman, who was counterintelligence liaison. So it's interesting to see where Bruce Solie is. This guy is ubiquitous. He's everywhere. When we go to Geneva and Nosenko coming across for the first time, he's interviewed by Pete Bagley and George Kisvalter, and in the next room, passing questions through. Who? Tell me. Bruce Solie.
Yeah, Solie. Yeah.
Yeah, Bruce Solie. Oh, interesting. Very interesting.
It's a small club in the end.
Yeah, it is. Well, maybe. We get to the Warren Commission, and the person that's in correspondence from the security office with David Slawson about Nosenko.
Yeah, that's correct, because I found his hand notes.
Yes, right. Who is it? It's Bruce Solie, same guy. Well, you go to the National Archives today and find that correspondence, even though it says it in the paperwork. It says, Slawson writes, see letter from Solie. Writes that. It's in his handwriting. It doesn't exist. It's not there. As far as they're concerned, it never existed, but it did. And thank God for what David Slawson did. He sort of paraphrases it. So we don't know the contents of Solie's letter, but what we do know is in April of 64, he's defending Yuri Nosenko. He's saying, really what he's saying is the stress it affected may be affecting his statements, because even at that time, doubts from the Soviet division were going to the Warren Commission saying, look, we can't trust what this guy's saying. We can't go with him. You can't believe him. Solie's defending him. April of 64, Bruce Solie's defending him. So, I mean, when I started this, I said, I may ramble. So, if you allow me to ramble, I'll ramble.
Go for it.
Okay, here's a ramble. So, let me think about how I'm going to do this. Or maybe I shouldn't ramble. Let me think about this for a second. Solie's defense of Nosenko is really something no person, no security officer would do. Especially Bruce Solie, who we know was a guy that was risk averse. Was a guy that wouldn't act recklessly. According to Pete Bagley, he was a doer, plodding. This guy was not the person that would be going writing a memo to David Slawson in which he was defending Nosenko at a time when other elements of the Soviet division were saying, we have doubts. That's not right. That's not right.
Yeah, it sounds almost like an internal war almost. Being against
not
each
so much
other.
an internal war. I think, Solie was striving to get Nosenko's statements accepted. And you have to ask, why was he doing that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone in his position shouldn't be doing that.
Exactly.
And when I took that to Pete Bagley, I said that to Pete. I said, look, this is April 64. This is way too early. What's he doing? I couldn't answer it. Pete couldn't answer that question, except it set up doubts in his mind about Solie. Previously, when I ventured to say to Pete, I'm not sure about Bruce Solie. There's something funny about this guy. And he was saying, "Oh, unthinkable, unthinkable." You know, when I proffered the idea that Bruce Solie could be a mole, he was saying, "No, no way, no way." But that defence is way too early.
It's not a defence, it's an apology.
Well, yeah, he's apologising for him. He's defending him. Way too early. Not only that, they've only just started the interrogations.
Yeah, if it's 64, he's only been in the picture for half a year, if that.
Is that, yeah. Oh, April 64. So
well, that's it. It's only 2 months.
It's way too early. And then to go on to the ramble, Jim Lazar in 1974 did a FOIA for Harold Weisberg and for Slawson's notes. And those pages that you have and that you copied are part of that rough draft of David Slawson, you know, the Warren Commission staff attorney. And it took over 30 years for that to be declassified. Well, I ask you, go to those pages and find why that was classified for over 30 years. The only thing there that's iffy is the fact that Solie was in contact with David Slawson, although there's no correspondence. We can't find it. It's not there. They deny it exists. And two, the content of what Solie was saying, was in Slawson's memo, in Slawson's rough notes, was that he was being briefed, basically, that any statements by Nosenko which weren't being accepted were because of the stress of defecting. That's way too early. That's way too early. You can't do that. You know, thinking about the Nosenko case in the Max, it's huge. I mean, we've got so many things that we could talk about. But I mean, you know, recently there's a movie called The Courier.
Yeah, I saw it.
You did?
Yeah.
Oh, it's about Greville Wynn.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I thought it was alright.
Right. Very interesting story. When our friend Yuri Nosenko comes across in Geneva, first time, he talks about this, and he talks about that, and he's trying to get the CIA interrogators into people interviewing him, Bagley and Kilsvalter. He's trying to get their confidence. He's trying to say, given the appearance that he's given them stuff. So he talks about various things. He talks about Mecca. You know about Mecca? No, Mecca was stuff that they smeared on various door handles and stuff like that. Magic stuff where you could track people. You know, you could follow them from yards away. You could do this stuff. Mecca. He also talks about Nosenko tells them about their technical abilities, how good KGB is with secreting small devices. Bear in mind, this is early 60s. Very small devices, which, such as in ashtrays or in vases, where they can bug conversations, you know. So yeah, this is all very interesting. And then he blurts out to Bagley and Kisvalter, and yes, we bugged the conversation between your embassy man Dulaki, who was a naval man in the Moscow embassy, and the Indonesian ambassador Sept. Right. This is all very small beer. Sept has spells it out. Z-E-P-P. So this is all being recorded and transcribed and all the rest of so they go back through all this stuff, and they look at all this stuff, and a long while later, quite a while later, they get the transcripts of Gravel Wynn's debrief with British intelligence, and he tells them that he was brought in one day, and the interrogator says, "Now, Mr. Veen," they called him Mr. Veen, not Wynn, Veen, Mr. Veen, what can you tell us about Sept? Who is Sept? Right, who is Sept? Because he hadn't got a clue, and he says no, he doesn't know anything about Sept. And the guy plays a tape recording to him, and the recording says he hears himself speaking to Oleg Penkovsky, and hears himself say, Penkovsky said, "How is Sept? How is Sept?" It's actually Zeph, Z-E-P-H, Zeph, who was a bar girl. That's how innocent it was, but it obviously concerned KGB, because they didn't know who the hell Sept was. This was some other name that could be important to KGB, could be someone working against them. So, what's a crucial fact there?
If I didn't know any better, it's for them to do their work better and basically investigate as such. I mean,
the story Nosenko gave, and the story the KGB gave, was that Penkovsky was caught by hard surveillance, routine surveillance. That's how he was caught. And that happened 2 months. 2 months of surveillance. The point is, Penkovsky and Gravel Wynn were being recorded in a restaurant 16 months before the official arrest. Now, what were the Russians doing
all that time?
All that time for 16 months, allowing Penkovsky to give up all these secrets. Why would they do that, Bart? Why would they do it?
Well, they'd only do that if they wanted to do it.
They wanted to do it because they were protecting a source. A protected source inside CIA that was so important that they had to let Penkovsky run. So when we talk about Nosenko being bona fide or not bona fide, for me it always comes down to that Sept. On that first interview, he blurted out Sept. Admittedly in the wrong context, but
I'll tell you one thing. I'm inclined to go along with what you say, but I've learned, especially while reading your archive, is that when you read something in a document, it doesn't really mean that that's what actually was said or reported as such. It is, you have to basically, you're dancing on ice when you are judging that particular report by itself as it is such
16 months before.
Yeah, okay, that's fair enough. That's a really good point.
16 months before,
but
2 months before the hard arrest. And you can't explain to me.
No,
nobody
it's
can
the
explain
time.
to me
The time.
that Penkovsky was given all this. They allowed him to give all this fantastic information. fantastic information.
Yeah, I mean,
That was source
you've got the time element of 16 months.
Source protection.
That works for you. Yeah, and that's because I'm not really. I say my research doesn't span over that long a period as such. So you could, there have been interviews afterwards, but the actual situation itself.
But it's about what we do.
Yeah.
What we do, what you do, and what people that do. Anybody else, I would say, that does deep research is doing. In effect, they're doing a mirror image of what a counterintelligence officer does. They look at very small details, something that like maybe there, which matches up with there.
The things that raise the questions. I mean, the most frustrating part I find is that I've got a question answered, but every question answered gives me 2 more extra questions on top of that. Because then you get the answer and you go, yeah, but what about this and what about that? Well, don't know about that. Well, I'm further stuck. I get one answer and, I've got 2 more questions now, which I didn't have before I got this answer. So that doesn't make it easier. Like I said earlier, I've trying to not to nail things to the cross immediately, because I found so many documents afterwards that put nuances to what I actually thought as such, that I just said, yeah, okay, I'm inclined to think, but I'm not 100% sure to believe this, such and such. And especially what you do with the whole intel thing.
What they said about the arrest of Pankowski was that it was hard surveillance. These are the bodies on the ground, the bugging of his apartment, all that stuff. This is not technical surveillance 16 months before in a fucking restaurant. Oh, sorry about that. It's just not. And that the way that Nosenko brought up that Zep on the first conversation, it was clear the KGB were concerned. Who the hell's Zep? We need to know about it. You see? Greville Wynne couldn't work that out. In his book, have you got that book?
No.
Man from Moscow. He talks about it, but he disguises it. What he says was the KGB officer came in and confronted him about something he said. He doesn't say anything about Zep at all. The fact that when Wynne says no, the guy plays a tape. And he said what amazed him was the clarity of the recording. The clarity of the recording, because he said obviously there should be background noise. All that was cut out of it.
No, that's not right.
I mean, this is very early to be able to have that sophistication to be able to do that.
So wouldn't it be in some sort of plan in the background?
To what?
To bringing this out? I mean, here's the thing. I don't believe anything the CIA does. I don't believe anything the CIA says. And I don't think the KGB would be any different. I mean, lying is a prerequisite. So if you plant something way before, what would be, let's just assume they plant something way before.
It's not planned.
What would the point be?
It's not planned.
No?
No. It's part of a conversation between Pankowski and Wynne.
Yeah, but...
It's just a normal conversation where Pankowski was saying to Wynne, how is Zef? The bar girl they knew from London. But that was picked up on the mics 16 months before the so-called real surveillance and a capture, an arrest of Pankowski.
Makes you wonder whether Zef is still alive. If she was a bar girl in the 50s. She'd be an old dear now, but
they called the Russians refer to as Zep. They don't quite get Zep, they called it. But I mean, I think that's that in a nutshell is me, because that meant the source protection. That meant a mole, and they knew that, and I think Angleton knew that. That's why he was so gung ho on going on the mole hunt. really going on the mole hunt.
Well, cost him his job, didn't it? Eventually.
Eventually, yeah. But you know, he was looking in the wrong place. Well, I say he was looking in the wrong place. I think, you know, there maybe was one person in the Soviet division, but a lot of people that he suspected, or that they suspected. But the person that was dishing out the files on these defectors was a person that one should really suspect, and that was Bruce Solie. He was dishing out the files to the FBI for deep investigations. Talk about the fox and the chicken coop. Goodness me.
So,
and the same guy,
right.
you know, Bruce Solie's the guy that somehow gets himself appointed to spend a year with Nosenko. Almost a year. And then finding that the guy was a bona fide defector. How does that work?
Amongst your paperwork, there's about 200 pages of whether Nosenko is a bona fide defector in 3 parts, I think, if I'm not mistaken. For the listeners and the viewers around the world, I shall put the link to all the Nosenko files in the description below this video. So once you've watched this video and feel inclined to go through all this, the heap of material, because it was a fair amount, of which also a fair amount is not available online, once again. So just click on that link underneath and it will take you there for your own reading pleasure as such. I just want to pick up, before we close off, we're close to the hour.
One thing.
Yeah.
What we have to look at is also continuity. You know, we started with the security officer in Geneva,
yeah,
passing through the questions, Bruce Solie. The man at the desk when Papic asked the question about Oswald, he's the guy that says, no, we don't know anything about Oswald. And then he's the guy in Geneva, you know, passing through the questions. And then we go to April '64, when we talk about writing to Slauson, defending Nosenko. And then we go to 67-ish, 67.
After he's basically been released from the mess.
68, with the long 9-month holiday interrogation of Nosenko, where they were shooting pool and smoking stogies, and Solie was saying, now Yuri, what you really meant to say was that. I don't think you quite meant to say that, Yuri. This is the stuff that Bagley was told about, that came from other counterintelligence officers that were privy to some of the conversations, some of the interrogations. It was a very softly interrogation, where there were a lot of prompting of Nosenko to make him bona fide. And then, of course, at the end, and that interrogation was carried out by Bruce Solie. And then at the end of that, there was a polygraph, a third and final polygraph, and which I think you have the notes of Richard Arthur. You know, it says it was terrible, awful polygraph, terrible, atrocious, you know. And yet that's what Nosenko is found bona fide. That's the thing that everybody nails to the mast, the final polygraph, which the foremost polygraph guy in America says just was dreadful, atrocious. And then we talk about you know, the rehabilitation of Nosenko. Solie's involved in that. And then he turns up as best man at Nosenko's wedding. I mean, there's a lot of continuity there from the original,
You can't make
from
this shit
the
up.
Oswald, you know, the Oswald defection, where he's the man on the bridge, blowing off, making sure that Papic doesn't get any information about Oswald. actually saying that they had no knowledge of Oswald when they did. Early, the security office were the people that had the early knowledge on Oswald. So, and then you go to 64, 62, you know, in the same thing again. Solie's involved in that. But, you know, there's a great massive documentation. Solie is all over the investigation, the JFK investigation. For Jim DiEugenio, the person that's all over Clay Shaw is Bruce Solie. You know, there are handwritten notes by Solie about, he's the guy that's really sitting on Clay Shaw stuff. Solie's the same guy that ordered, to set up the system, what's called the flower petal system inside the security office, where they remove documents from their files before giving them to the church committee. And then after the church committee finished, using the flower petal system, where they had a little flower in the corner, purple flower, the documents were put back. Denying that a Senate committee documents, and he was the guy that instituted that system. He was the guy involved in that. So for me, Solie is a key guy all over the Kennedy investigation, all over the Kennedy assassination investigation, all over the Nosenko business. Crucial guy. And in my mind, suspicious enough for me to think a mole. Right in the heart of the security office. Unthinkable, as Pete Bagley originally said to me, but then changed his mind.
So then Nosenko. Did Nosenko also get asked during the Garrison investigation? Because that is something I've missed. Were there any questions for him, about him, or anything on him during that time? They didn't know about it at that time. It was all kept hush-hush. Right. So when did it actually start to come out, all that? Is it just during the HSCA or is it later even?
What, for Nosenko?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it got, you know, publicity, got legs during the HSCA period.
Right.
Yeah. But what they did, what the CIA did, very cleverly, was to give up, they appointed a guy called John Hart to do their own, what's known as the Hart Report, which was basically, you know, basically a support document for Nosenko's bona fides. So John Hart did that. That's really when the publicity came, and what CIA did cleverly was not really to give up all the doubts about Nosenko. That's what they, you know. Let's keep the doubts about Nosenko's bona fides over there. What we give up is that Nosenko was badly treated, was poorly treated when he was in the bunker. So they gave that up, and that was all over the place. I mean, it's true. Hart came up with a note in which Pete Bagley was supposed to write down various things, you know, send him to the loony bin and, you know, stuff like that, and terminate him. Terminate him was another thing.
Okay.
But
one more thing.
What I should say is, interestingly, I said to Pete Bagley about the note which he is supposed to have written.
Yeah.
He didn't remember writing it.
Oh.
He did not remember writing that note.
Was it his handwriting?
Yeah, it was his handwriting, but he only ever saw copies. He never saw original. So the note, well, you know, they're very clever. That could have been fabricated.
Could have been.
I mean, he wouldn't believe it.
Overall,
I suggested that, but he wouldn't believe it.
Overall,
he just said, well, maybe it was something I just jotted down, but I don't think so. I think that was put there to really put the heat on as far as the treatment's concerned of Nosenko. You know, it really made those people in the Soviet division that thought Nosenko was not bona fide, it made them look bad. And it kept the doubts really undercover. That it was never really surfaced. They really, I mean, Klein did, the HSCA staffer did try and bring it out, but
the
sexy stuff
yeah.
was a treatment. That was it.
I mean, overall, it's an incredibly interesting story. There's a lot to it. There's a lot of paperwork. I can easily say there's a few thousand pages of the stuff to go through. The polygraph, all different things are basically discussed in great depth. And sadly, I've got to call it a day because I'm running out of battery. So, but we're going now. So
it's a long way from Dealey Plaza.
Yeah, it is. Thank you again for talking.
Yeah, no problem.
And we'll come back again next month with another subject, and we'll keep producing, and we'll see where this ends. And I hope you all enjoy this one. Thanks very much.
Okay, no problem.
Bye.